Hello guys and welcome back. So in our last lesson we learned about the creation of the concentration camps and how the Nazi plan for Jews shifted from simply forcing them into ghettos to moving them to the concentration camps. In 1942, the planning and vision for the Jewish community of Europe darkened even more. The Nazis created what we call the final solution, and this was the code name for the murder of all Jews within reach. This was a policy of deliberate and systematic genocide and led to the killing of 90% of Poland's Jews and 2/3 of the Jewish population of Europe. Now, the decision itself was reached at a conference that we call the Onesy Conference. This was a meeting of senior government officials held in Berlin. The murder of Jews was already happening, and the decision to exterminate the Jews had already been made. The conference itself, which was held in this building, lasted about 90 minutes. And at this conference, it was emphasized that once the deportation was complete, so once the movement of people to the camps was complete, the decision of what to do with them was entirely within the power of the SS. So it was completely putting this power to decide their fates into the hands of the SS. It meant that in the last 2 years of the war, the persecution of Jews turned into an attempt to murder every last Jew possible. So we've shifted. We didn't have this before. We've moved gradually over time into a much more destructive policy towards the Jewish people. And at this point, 1942, there is the stated aim of trying to exterminate every last person. Okay, so this is probably the most difficult piece of the whole journey to kind of learn about, listen to, and talk about. So I'm going to try to explain this in a fair way to give it the credit it deserves that we need to know, so that we understand it fully. But I don't want to dwell particularly on this area. And obviously, I'm asking you to be really mature as you listen to what happened. So earlier on in the war, the Nazis had trialed the use of gas vans to kill small groups of people. From 1942, death camps were built using this technology. Belzec was completed first, followed by Sobibor and Treblinka. More Jews were killed at Treblinka than any other camp apart from Auschwitz. And these camps were kept top secret. They'd been specifically designed to kill tens of thousands of people every day. They were not supposed to keep prisoners, and very few Jews escaped death if they were sent to these places. They're not places like the concentration camps. There aren't barracks. There's not places to live. It's literally a process of arrive and be killed. So I'm going to briefly explain what happened. On arrival to this new type of camp, the death camps, unlike the labor camps, Jews were separated into men and women, stripped, showered, given uniforms, and sent to their barracks. Almost all of the group were sent to the gas chambers together straight from the train. A complex had been built in each camp with a changing room where Jews were first asked to take off their clothes. And then each complex had rooms that were connected to exhaust fumes, where a chemical called Zyklon B was sent into the unventilated rooms. There are no windows, there are no vents. Once everybody had died from inhaling the chemical gas, the bodies were burnt in crematoriums by a selected group of Jews who were also prisoners called the Sonderkommando. They had the awful job of burning and stripping the bodies of any valuable possession they could find. Around 178 million German Reichsmarks worth of Jewish property, equivalent to 616 million euros, was taken from these victims' bodies. In Treblinka, 800,000 people were killed in this way in 15 months. At Auschwitz, 1.5 million were murdered. Now, towards the end of the war, the Allied forces began to take more and more Nazi territory. This meant that some of the concentration camps were under threat of being discovered and liberated by the Allies, as we call it. We call it liberation, when the Allied forces arrived and essentially set everyone free. In order to avoid this, the Germans forced the prisoners in many of the camps to go on what we have become to call death marches. Now, the marches took place mostly between the summer and autumn of 1944 and May 1945. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were moved from camps on the Eastern Front into camps inside of Germany. So if the camp was on the edge of where the Germans still had territory and they could see that the Allies, the Soviets or the Americans or the British were coming close, they would take all of the prisoners and make them march to another camp further in. The Germans wanted to continue using this available slave labour to help the war effort, as well as hide the evidence of what they had done from the approaching Allies. Many of the prisoners were already sick and weak after months or years of violence and starvation, and were forced to march tens of miles, often in the snow. They were often transported by foot or by train without food or shelter for days, and many were shot for falling behind. The longest march took place in January 1945, 9 days before the Red Army reached Auschwitz. The Germans marched 56,000 prisoners out of the camp 35 miles away. Around 15,000 of these died on the way. I just wanted to briefly show you this map because we can see the kind of distances that people were made to walk. So each of the color lines is from a particular camp, and you can see the different journeys and directions that the prisoners were forced to march. This is right at the end, you know, they're weeks away from being liberated, and they're taken on these horrendous journeys where tens of thousands of them perish. So it's just a completely awful way for the Germans to have treated this at the end. Okay, so the last part of this whole journey, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what happened at the end, what happened with liberation, how were people freed. So, as these Allied forces, as I previously just mentioned, moved across Europe, they began to encounter tens of thousands of concentration camp prisoners. Many of these had survived forced marches, the death marches, and almost all were suffering from starvation and disease. In late July 1944, Soviet forces approached Lublin and the camp of Majdanek. This was the first concentration camp to be liberated. Soviet officials invited journalists to inspect the camp and evidence the horrors that had occurred there. In January 1945, the Soviets liberated Auschwitz. As you can see in the picture behind me, a Soviet soldier here helping these two Jewish survivors out of the camp. The Nazis had forced the majority of prisoners to march west on the march I told you about a moment ago, but the Soviets found over 6,000 emaciated, that means starving, prisoners alive when they entered the camp. They found abundant evidence of mass murder, despite the Germans' attempts to destroy it. So US forces also liberated camps such as Buchenwald, and they liberated 20,000 prisoners here. The British liberated 60,000 prisoners at Bergen-Belsen. Sadly, most of these prisoners were in critical condition due to a typhus epidemic, and more than 10,000 of them died from the effects of malnutrition and disease within weeks of liberation. It was actually this typhus epidemic, moments before the British arrived in Bergen-Belsen, that killed Anne Frank, who wrote, the really famous book, Anne Frank's Diary. Liberators saw unspeakable conditions in the Nazi camps. The small number of inmates who survived looked like skeletons, and many were so weak that they couldn't move. Disease was a continuing threat and danger, and many camps had to be burnt down to prevent the spread. The road to recovery for these victims was long. The first intake of food proved fatal for many prisoners who were too weak to digest it. So what happened quite a lot of the time was soldiers would arrive, be completely overwhelmed by the shock of what they're seeing. Human nature is to try to give these people food. So soldiers would go through their bags and give them everything they had, chocolate bars, rich calorie tins of food, the things they'd been provided by the army to keep them alive, essentially to provide high calories in small quantities. Now, this was actually unknowing to the soldiers, a move which could have killed many of the survivors who ate this food, because their bodies weren't strong enough to digest high calorie food anymore. So that was a really kind of, one of the barriers that was still in the way even after prisoners had been liberated. People went through all of this only to find the battle to recover and rebuild their lives was yet to be fought and would by no means be easy. Rebuilding required years of effort for those who were deeply traumatized and often still very young. Special centres were established to help with resettlement, but the scale of refugees was colossal. There were 10 million displaced people at the end of the war, which created many, many obstacles to trying to get these people home. Many returned to villages or towns where people had moved into their homes, taken their possessions, and most of the time turned their heads and looked away as they had been dragged into ghettos, imprisoned, and sent to concentration camps. As they returned, they were also treated with hostility. Many feared they would want their property back and they would lose out. In Poland, for example, a further 1,500 Jewish survivors were murdered by Poles after they returned from concentration camps. Many Jewish survivors went first to a displaced persons camp, a temporary facility set up by the Allies and the Red Cross. Many survivors suffered psychological problems caused by the horrendous treatment they had faced, and the camp facilities were initially very poor. So even in these kind of places of safety, there were really significant problems. Many survivors got married in the displaced persons camp. There's loads and loads of really lovely stories of kind of love emerging in the concentration camps where people met, people they ended up marrying, and they went through that journey together, they helped each other survive. And some even began to start new families there. At their height, these camps held 250,000 Jewish survivors. Eventually, they were no longer needed, and the last Jewish displaced persons camp closed in Germany in 1953. The Red Cross did all they could to help return victims home. However, many no longer had homes, families, or communities to go back to. It was often very, very difficult to track down what happened to family members, and often this was met with disappointment and tragedy. In 1935, the German government, the Nazis, had taken away the citizenship of Jews living in Germany. As they invaded and occupied lands, the Nazis took away the nationality from millions of Jews across Europe. When the war ended, Jewish survivors had no papers and no passports. In essence, they had become people with no nationality, no official name, no home, and no country, which made it very, very difficult bureaucratically and in terms of paperwork to get them home again. Due to these problems, along with hostilities of many old communities, many Jews decided to emigrate from Europe to settle in either America, Palestine, and also some went to Britain. The British government refused to allow mass immigration of Jewish refugees, but they did have a couple of schemes like the boys we looked at a while ago. We looked at the ghettos and a couple of those survivors who went back to Britain after the Holocaust. The vast majority of those who left Europe went to Palestine. This put pressure on the British mandate in Palestine and led to the announcement of the State of Israel, which then followed with the Arab-Israeli war, which I'm not going to go into, but that's just a little understanding of why one thing in history always kind of has an effect, a ripple effect on other things. So lots of Jews felt completely isolated. They'd gone through this awful traumatic experience and they wanted to go somewhere they felt safe, they felt welcomed. That happened to be Palestine because of the idea of a Jewish homeland, which then created the issues with the Arab-Israeli conflict that are still going on in the Middle East today. So that effectively wraps up everything we need to know about the Holocaust. I hope that you've been really interested in this, that you can see it with maturity, with an emotional maturity, and that you can, if you continue to be interested, you might want to read some of those books I told you about, those survivor stories. We need to make sure we are intelligent and we are mature about this topic, and we can pass on our knowledge if it comes up in conversation and treat it in the right way.